Samdach Excellency, ladies and gentlemen, welcome once again to Cambodia Economic Policy Growth Dialogue. Today we have a good opportunity to have a discussion on Cambodia Vision 2050 because as a country we come a long way after the Paris Peace Accord, after the war, the reconstruction side, the development. We come a long way. But we have to look further to the future when a few years from now we will graduate from a least developed country. But our ambition is much higher. We want to attain a high income country status. And there's no better topic to discuss today is on Cambodia Vision 2050. And I have two speakers from the World Bank. One is Dr. Faya Hayati. He's a senior economist with the World Bank. And the other is Dr. Sebastian Eckert, who is practice manager of the economic policy in East Asia of the World Bank. And we will have a conversation on that issue. And I hope that we can share some of our view, our perspective. And from that on, that's it. It's just a good discussion. And of course, it's a vision. It means that nothing is set in stone. My colleague, my friends from the World Bank may have their own perspective, but I'm also may have my own opinion. But it'd be good to have this discussion. So, Faya, can I call you Faya?
Yes, of course.
All right. Seb, I call you Seb. It's easier. So, basically, Cambodia came a long way, as I said in my introduction. You know, it's been more than 30 years already. We emerged as a post-war country. Really difficult time, right? Difficult time. I recall at that time I came back in '93. The UN just pulled out after they complete their mission, and the roads plenty of pothole, electricity blackout 3 or 4 times a day. The airport half burned and half bullet ridden. Now we are looking to have the opening of a brand new airport in a few months from now. So we come a long way in that sense. But from your perspective, you helped the government, the World Bank helped the government to design a Vision 2050. What is your, I would say foremost, what motivates you to look for a way to work with the government on that particular vision?
Yeah, thank you so much for having us here, Minister Sapana. It's a great pleasure and honor for us to join this policy discussion that you have here on Cambodia. You know, I think for us at the World Bank, there's very few honors greater than to work in support of such a ambitious and noble undertaking of trying to raise the quality of life of your population to reach the high and lofty standards of a high-income country. And so the Prime Minister issued a decision back in October of last year saying that it's time to now think about developing a vision and a path for that vision to become high income. And the World Bank is honored to be one of the sort of key partners to start that conversation with government. And for us, this is a big conversation, right? This is trying to imagine all of the different elements that come together to push forward a country to reach the high level of a high-income country. And one of the angles which the World Bank is most, I guess, experienced on and has experiences with helping other countries develop is particularly on the economic part. But it's a bigger conversation. Yeah. Becoming high income is about values, it's about culture, it's about common principles that unite a country. And they're not particularly the areas that we are more focused on. We are more interested in what sort of economic dynamism is required and what are the changes necessary to go from where we are today to try and become a high-income country. And it's a very difficult journey. You know, the World Bank recently published this report called the World Development Report, and it was looking at this phenomena we call the middle income trap. Yeah. And this is this idea that countries generally get to grow pretty quickly and efficiently when they're lower income. So, when Cambodia was 500 GNI per capita, it was able to go from 500 to 1,500 GNI per capita really quickly in 12 years.
Yeah.
That's double. Vietnam was double that speed. ASEAN took 50% longer. So Cambodia was really quick. But where we have found globally it's difficult is how do you go from 2,000 to 14,000 GNI per capita, which means how much money the average person roughly makes. That part is very difficult. If you look back in the past 30 years, since 1990, the whole country, right? The whole world, hundreds of countries, about 100 of them were in this middle income area. Only 30 countries have emerged out of this trap. And of those 30, 13 of them were because they had very strong access to the EU and a lot of subsidies and support. Another 14 of these small island states like St. Kitts and Nevis that, it's not that difficult to quickly go up when you're only 50,000 people. Then there's a few oil-rich countries that found oil. If you get rid of those, we're only talking about 3 countries in the entire world in the past 30 years that really emerged from middle income to high income. And if you add up all of the population for all of these people, so the whole 34 countries, the entire population is the size of Pakistan. So it's very few people that are able to get out of this middle income trap. And part of this vision is to try and learn from, well, why are these countries struggling to emerge from this? And how can we apply that to be relevant to Cambodia? And I think that's where the World Bank is trying to sort of engage in this discourse with the government and bring this experience to help avoid some of the pitfalls and to sort of customize the journey for the Cambodia strengths and where we have to sort of progress the most.
Yeah, well, I think it's very important to look forward, but we need to take stock. As you rightly said, that not many countries was able to grow that fast when you reach a certain stage. Cambodia, we start from the very, very, very low after in 93. So for about 20 years, the World Bank consider Cambodia as the economic Olympic of growth, right? 7% growth for the last 20 years. But now, the new dynamics. But I would say with the new dynamics, you have also new factor, right? Geopolitical factor, geoeconomic factor, regional integration. Many things change. Many things change. So how, if we are to look forward, what would be the key area that we need to be mindful of as a start? What area you think we have to?
So also thank you for having us, and I think this is a very important discussion, and we indeed consider it a privilege to work with Cambodia and to partner with Cambodia on this journey. I think looking back is important, and as you said, Minister Sopana, Cambodia is in many ways a success story. It has achieved very rapid growth and perhaps more importantly, very rapid improvements in people's lives, in income, but also in outcomes on health, education, and so on. Now, naturally, if you're successful, that like with people, countries tend to set high ambitions looking ahead. And we see that here in Cambodia. So clearly this, as Faya was also mentioning, that objective of achieving high income status by 2050 is a difficult one and an ambitious one, but it's the right one. You want to be ambitious in your targets. Now, what I would perhaps say is that this was always hard, and that's why the number of countries that have succeeded in this transition is so small. If we look globally. Now, I would say if we look at some of the changes we see globally, I would say these changes don't make it necessarily easier. And I would maybe perhaps mention two that I think are very important. One is trade. As we know, trade has been an important catalyzer and driver of development, not just here in Cambodia, but if we look across, especially this part of the world. And of course, the trade landscape globally is changing. Yes. We've, of course, seen changes in the most recent past, but even if we look back the last 2-3 years, we've seen that globally, there has been an increase in trade barriers and some fragmentation. And of course that creates risks, but also opportunities. And I think for a small open economy like Cambodia, it's important to manage those risks, but also see and try to see some opportunities. The other important factor that I would mention that will shape the future opportunities and risks again is technology. So clearly with sort of accelerated and disruptive innovation around smart manufacturing, this is shifting comparative advantages across countries in the manufacturing sector. It does threaten to some extent labor-intensive manufacturing, which of course has been until now an important driver here in Cambodia. And then if we look beyond manufacturing, if we look at artificial intelligence, of course it's very hard to predict where that technology will go, but it's safe to say that it is going to also create disruption, perhaps in this case, maybe also to some parts of manufacturing, because you can make smart machines and maybe automate even more production processes. But perhaps artificial intelligence will have an even bigger impact on services, which we also know maybe less so here in Cambodia. But if we look, for example, to countries like the Philippines, India, where you had very dynamic service sectors, of course their technology is also changing the dynamics there. So it's important to respond to that and to build economic policies and institutions that are resilient and adaptive, because clearly there is a very dynamic context. And so as we think about policy options for Cambodia, I think it's important to bear that in mind and to design policies that we don't set for the next decade, but policies that are adapted as the context and the environment changes.
Well, you talk about trade, you talk about technology. These are all man-made, man-control. But I think we have to also taking care of the climate, which is climate change is dramatically changing the dynamics of trade, the dynamics of economics, the dynamic of poverty. So climate change is definitely one area. What do you think of that?
Yeah, the World Bank published a report on Cambodia about a year ago. It's called the Country Climate Development Report, which tries to understand exactly this question you just asked. How does climate and growth go hand in hand? And how do they support each other? And what are the issues to ensure that growth is sustainable for the environment? And so, we did some very complicated modeling to try and understand if climate change goes in some of the scarier directions that we all worried it might go to, what is the impact? And, our simulations suggest it's almost 10% of GDP could be lost in these situations. Now, 10% of GDP is a number, but what does that number mean? That means farmers, their crops aren't as productive as yield. They get flooded more frequently. The working temperatures in urban areas rise such that construction workers can't be outside for many hours of the day. So climate change affects GDP, but it affects GDP because it affects people's lives. And Cambodia already is at one of the highest risk countries exposed to climate change because it has this unfortunate geographical situation where we have droughts and floods, where we experience typhoons and we experience heat. And so it's a place that even though we contribute, Cambodia contributes 0.1% of global emissions, but it suffers the consequence of what's happening in the world. And so that's why a lot of the efforts of the government of Cambodia, its long-term neutrality strategy, carbon neutrality strategy, is something that's really important. Even though it's not a significant contributor, it's demonstrating that it recognizes and it's taking its fair share of responsibility to ensure that the world and its partners take climate change seriously. And so I think this is an area that is important. And like most things, when things go bad in global external shocks, the people that feel it the most are poor households that don't have the same quality of building infrastructure, that don't have the same fiscal savings and abilities to absorb these shocks to their productions. And so they are the most vulnerable to climate change. And I think now switching to the growth perspective, it also presents Cambodia with a lot of opportunities for new sources of growth.
Yes.
You know, these green technologies and manufacturing of products that feed into green value chains. Here, you know, Cambodia has a strong workforce of, you know, it's the fourth highest labor force participation rate in the world, right? Cambodians are workers. These are not Cambodians are not people that sit at home and are waiting for things to happen. They're in factories, they're on farms, they're in the shops. And so how do we take that energy and that strong passion to work and move up the value chain out of these low value added manufacturing or low skilled agriculture into some of these new green shoots of technology? Now that's the vision, but you can't just say we're going to start building EV cars and EV plants. You need certain environment, business environment around it to enable it. But I think that's one of the promising parts, is that there is this global demand for green goods, green products, and I think Cambodia should really participate in that new direction.
Well, I would say from that perspective, I can relate to it, because Cambodia primarily we're an agriculture country, and let's face it, you know. Now we have a cashew nut, we have a black pepper, but you know, whenever the season change, the climate change, and the farmer could lose their crop for the year. So I mean, that's something that I would come back later on to discuss on how climate change will impact the growth pattern that will affect our ability to reach the objective of Vision 2050. But I want to come back to the Vision 2050. What are the various pillars that you think we should put in place to build the basis, the foundation of the Vision 2050?
Yeah, this is a question we are thinking about. And I think we see it as being largely focusing around three key areas. One, I think when you compare Cambodia to recently achieved high-income countries, there's probably three areas where we can see that is the most important binding constraints and gaps to close. Yeah. I think the first and foremost is human capital. Okay. And human capital means the productive ability of a human being to contribute to their life, be it good health, be it skills and capabilities. And this dimension, which we can talk about, I think, in greater detail as we continue, is probably the first and foremost building block to getting to high income status. I'll give you one statistic and then we can come back to this conversation later. You know, the new high income countries, they roughly have around about 40%, so 36% of their economies in high skilled jobs. Okay. Medium to high skilled jobs. Cambodia has about 10. And what that means is every year for the next 25 years, for us to get to that level, we would have to be creating just over 100,000 new skilled jobs to get to that number, 100,000 a year. But we're only making about 10,000 a year right now. So that's a 10 times increase in creating these jobs. And part of the reasons we're not creating these jobs is we don't have the skilled human capital to do it. So I think human capital is the first part. The second is a sort of structural transformation of the engines of growth in the economy. And at the center of that conversation is the business environment. Okay. Going back to agriculture, you know, 36% of this country works in agriculture. The average high-income country, 9%, right? Same statistic, about 115,000 people a year have to exit agriculture. So there's about 3 million people working in there, would have to exit agriculture into higher quality manufacturing and services. But it's only about 8,000 a year right now. So that acceleration has to be significantly quicker. And there's other issues with the business environment we can chat about as well that I think there has been good progress, but it needs further progress. And then I think the third area that sort of is essential for this transformation is the ability to implement reforms
Yeah.
and to see these reforms come into fruition. And that's difficult. It's always difficult. It's difficult for every country. No country has been able to solve this in a instant way or in the stroke of a pen. It takes time. So I think for me, having started to think about some of these conversations, it revolves around human capital, the business environment and structural transformations, and then I think ultimately the ability to improve implementation of government reforms, public service delivery, to safeguard the journey forward and to ensure it stays on track.
I think I do concur with you on the first pillar, which is the human resource. You need quality, skilled workforce as the economy grow, as the industry evolve. You mentioned about AI. You mentioned about the fourth industrial revolution, that sort of thing. That require new skill. But I would say the other thing that I think is also is very important, and you rightly touched the heart of it, which is the heart of doing business.
Yeah.
How do you improve? How do you reform so that your ecosystem is conducive to doing business? Because let's face it, Cambodia is an open economy. We thrive because of trade.
Yeah.
But our market is too small, to produce anything if we don't have a third country market. So basically, we need FDI before we can produce something to export. But FDI require supporting infrastructure, supporting ecosystem, a conducive environment that they can invest. So what do you think of that?
I think you're absolutely right. So I think clearly in order to create these jobs that Faya mentioned, not just the number, but the quality of jobs, and to get the structural transformation, you need to attract investment, foreign investment, but also domestic investment.
Yes.
We've seen that in other countries as well, that especially as you transition from middle income to high income, it's important to build a domestic private sector that is productive as well. Now, I think the important areas that we typically look at is the regulatory environment, where you need to have a transparent, predictable regulatory environment grounded in the rule of law, ultimately, right?
Yeah.
I think a lot of it also depends on the implementation. It's not just about writing regulations and laws that are good, but then ensuring they are implemented in a fair and transparent manner. I think it goes beyond that. So I think we also need to consider some aspects of infrastructure investment, which is important to ensure market connectivity. You mentioned rightfully that the Cambodian domestic market is relatively small, but ensuring some connectivity there is nevertheless important. And then, of course, connectivity to other markets, including in the region, where, of course, you are, in a sense, fortunate that you are surrounded by a relatively dynamic region where you have many countries that are growing and where you have a rise of the middle class. Where you potentially can sell goods. But for that to happen, you need to have good physical transport infrastructure that ensures connectivity at a low cost and a competitive cost. And then, of course, also ensuring that your border is not just open in the sense that you have low tariffs and so on, but also open in the sense that border management and the ease by which goods can cross the border is addressed. The final point I would mention, which is an important one, is services. So what we also see is that as countries transition from middle income to high income, of course, the service sector becomes more important as a driver of growth. In fact, if you look at high income economies, the service sector is usually the largest part of the economy. And again, I would say here that there are opportunities with digitization and so on for Cambodia to seize opportunities. But again, you need to create an environment. Sometimes that means, again, thinking about the regulatory environment, the openness also to foreign investment in service sectors, which can sort of create dynamism and competition in the sector that kind of stimulates innovation and growth. And that's important in its own right, but we also see that with the shifts in manufacturing, services are also often a key input. For example, logistics is a case in point, right? If you have a very dynamic, competitive logistics sectors, it also helps your manufacturing and agricultural sector because they will have access to cost competitive logistics services that will enable them to sell to domestic markets, but also regional and global markets.
Well, I mean, I can help but recall 30 some years ago when I was lecturing at the National Institute of Management, and I asked my student, I said, how many of you guys, when you graduate, would join the private sector? 2 timid hand raised. 2. And then how many of you will join the public sector? Everybody raised their hand. Because at that time there was no private sector. So we fast forward a few years later when Cambodia joined WTO, there's about 10 or 20 company, decent company, Cambodian company. It's about it. Fast forward now, we have the association, the Chamber of Commerce, you have the Oknya Association. They have over 1,000 company, decent size, not that big, not that small. But I mean, we come a long way, but it's still, I consider this private sector as a pillar, as a strong pillar of our economy. But for them to be able to play a good role to support the economy, they need to understand more about the trade rule. Because look, we are trading with the world. You have to understand the standard, you have to understand trade facilitation, you got to understand the rule of origin, that sort of thing. So that leads me to the issue of trade, which I think it's very important in the context of now the U.S. Reciprocal tariff, that sort of thing. We have to diversify. We have to diversify anyway because assuming Trump didn't come to power, all right, we will still have to diversify come 2029 when we graduate from least developing country to become a developing country. So diversification is very important. We have asset, of course. We are contemplating joining the CPTPP. We are negotiating, several bilateral free trade agreement. What is your take on that one?
Yeah, I think for me, trade, the conversation on trade centers around one word, and it's competitiveness.
Okay.
It's how competitive can we be to make this one thing in Cambodia and get it out of Cambodia compared to somebody else. And on this, I think the point you were making about the business environment, the human capital story, they all come into play when it comes into trade. Because if we take longer and slower and cost more to make the same thing as our neighbors do, well, people will buy it from our neighbors. And when I think of the business environment, some of the points that Seb was making, the price of electricity here is double what it is in Vietnam. The cost of logistics is double what it is here than it is in Malaysia. It takes 3 times longer to get an import license here than it does in Vietnam, 6 times than in Indonesia. And so all of these things affect the productivity and competitiveness of our firms. And so if we look at labor productivity in simplest terms is how much value of products does a human being create in Cambodia every single year. So in formal firms, which is what we measured, it's around about $7,000 worth of things a year. But if you walk across the border to Vietnam, that same human being in that context makes 3 times more, $21,000 per year, that same average firm employee. If you go the other way to Thailand, that same person makes $35,000 a year. So 5 times more than a Cambodian labor worker. All of that measures the health and productivity of your business environment. And if we want to be able to compete in a world where trade is becoming less and less the path that it used to be, Seb mentioned this earlier on, the role of trade distortions a decade ago, we used to see around about 400 new trade distortions. So a trade distortion is adding a tariff here, adding a behind the border, only 400 a year. Now, last year, the year before that, the year before that, the year before that, it's about 3,000 new a year. That's 10 times more. So the world and its trading relationship is changing. It's been not just changing this year, it's been changing for a while. And so if we want to compete in this world, we have to improve the way, the speed, the time it takes for us to produce something. It reminds me of a story that my colleague Sadeth just said to us the other day at an event we had. He tells this story of these two backpackers walking up the mountains of Sihanoukville. And for some reason, they see a tiger in this mountain. And they're very scared, you know, and they're looking at each other, what should we do? Now, all of a sudden, one of the backpackers starts to take off his backpack and starts running. And then his friend says to him, "You are so foolish. You think you can outrun this tiger?" And his friend said, "I'm not outrunning this tiger. I'm outrunning you." And so the point of the story is, you just can't be the slowest. You have to be faster than the person next to you and faster than the person next to you. Because the tiger will eat that person and you will compete quicker. And so the joke in the story is that we can only control how fast we run. We can't control what's happening in the world and these different shocks that are coming from climate, from trade, but we can control our speed, our productivity. And I think that presents a lot of promise for Cambodia to be able to deal with this changing world, is to control our own house. The business environment, the human capital, it all comes into this word of competitiveness and productivity.
Competitiveness, productivity, it all boils down to the skilled labor force.
Yeah.
The skilled labor force boils down to access to good education,
Yes.
to good vocational skill. What do you think of that?
No, that's true. Of course, having a skilled labor force is essential for competitiveness, right? And if we look at Cambodia, ultimately, your most precious resource is your people, right? So investing in building the skills is important. And in fact, Faya knows the numbers much better. But if we compare, again, Cambodia to some of its peers, some of the educational outcomes are not as good as some of the competitors. So in a way, at this point, other countries on that dimension are clearly running faster. So I think it's important to accelerate. And really, that's, I think, one of the no regret policies. Because whatever happens on trade, whatever happens on technology, having skilled labor force will make individuals more adaptable, but it will also make the economy more adaptable. So I would say that's a no regret policy for Cambodia. Now I would maybe add one point, and this is echoing something Faya said earlier. You know, part of the story there is investment, putting the financial resources, but then, and that's maybe to some extent the easier part here in Cambodia, because Cambodia has actually a lot of fiscal space. Your debt levels, public debt levels are relatively low and so on. So yeah, you can maybe generate a bit more revenue on the tax side, but in principle, you have the financial space. What is harder, I think, is again the implementation. So how do you build an education system that translates financial inputs into actual results of students, right? And I think that has a lot to do with the institutional setup, the quality of teachers, the allocation of teachers in the system to really deliver good educational outcomes. But I think as a priority for where Cambodia is, and given the environment in which we operate, I think this is really an important and maybe the most important priority.
You mentioned no regret policy. What other no regret policy can you think of?
So I think in this context, I think one element is what Faya talked about, right? Anything that reduces costs and that improves efficiency is always good, right? Whatever happens, if you can do more with less, is good, right? I would say the other one I would add is perhaps cooperation, because you are a relatively small economy, so you as a country will benefit from building partnerships with other countries, including in the region. And I think you mentioned also ASEP, You mentioned CPTPP.
Yeah.
So obviously ASEAN has been around for a long time, and there's many different platforms to engage, I think, in mutually beneficial cooperation in the region. And this is important because we do see that, of course, the region is becoming a more important, not just factory of the world, but
Yeah.
also consumer market of
Yeah.
the world, right? We do see that in the region, it's one of the fastest growing consumer markets in the world, including ASEAN, by the way, where you have this rise of the middle class. And of course, that presents an opportunity to foster collaboration, to lower barriers of trade, and to harmonize, for example, standards and so on and so forth across the region.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you touch on the issue of regional integration, which I think is very important for a open market, an open economy, a trade-driven economy like Cambodia. I think in recent years, Cambodia become very active in the international scene in terms of market. In ASEAN is a good example. We're late player. We're the last one to join about 20 years ago, but we become a very active player in ASEAN. We host 3 summit, three times already. So every 10 years we host one summit. But it showed that we become more and more, I say, adapt to the international trade. We look at the world as more that's our oyster. You know, the world is our oyster. It's a blue what you call blue ocean strategy. You know, go out there, right? But I want to come back to another challenge which I think will definitely hit us, you know, whether we like or we know or not, is that at some point when you diversify trade, there are so many new trade regulation now. And you did mention all these non-tariff measure, this barrier, this 3,000, 4,000 there is there.
Yeah.
But how do we as a small economy can cope? If I talk about climate change, right? You're talking about the border, the tax adjustment, CBAM, you have the deforestation, God knows what other regulation, the due diligence, that sort of thing. So these are all the element, the external element that we, as a country, we must deal with.
I think, if I may, on this, of course, you can't really control the policies of your trading partners.
Yeah.
So you can, to some extent, negotiate, but of course, those policies are set by policymakers
Yeah.
in those countries. Now, again, it comes back to what is under the control of policymakers here in Cambodia, and of course, there is potential to lower trade costs, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Through logistics, you mentioned also trade facilitation,
Yeah.
border management, a lot of the non-tariff
Yeah.
barriers that impose real costs on exporters and importers. So I think that's one, one response to that. In addition, of course, to trying to negotiate with your partners in the region and so on to maybe lower some of those market access barriers in key markets.
Yeah, I think, you know, capacity building is very important here. You know, really working hard to understand all that. Because as you rightly said, we cannot control what the EU is introduced in terms of regulation. But what we can control is that we can learn more. We can reach out more. I recall when we negotiated the accession to the WTO, it's a lot of barrier. And sometimes you have some advice to say, look, ask them to lower the bar. And my view is the opposite. I say, no, we should not ask them to lower the bar. Because if they lower the bar, we have it easy. We just walk across. So right now, with all the help that is out there, because at that time, we just emerged from war. So we have a lot of support from development partner. I say, no, with all that support, ask them to train us to be a better athlete so that we can jump higher. It's better than lowering the bar and then we walk across. 30 years later, you're still walking across. So I think the same thing here. I would say the private sector now are in much, much better position than 20 years ago. I always tell them, I say, look, guys, you guys are doing well now. Stop asking what the government can do for you. You have the money, high consultant, high expert people, because you're not making 100 product, you're making 5 product. If that say I take for example, if you're exporting mango, okay, I mean, all you need is a few consultants who understand market access to Australia or to China or to Japan. They can advise you, and then you work on that. So to me, I think it's Cambodia after 30 years. I think we have the endowment now.
And I think it can actually help with productivity. I think, when it comes to, for example, quality standards,
Yeah.
some of them may be related to policies, but sometimes it's also consumer demand, right?
Yes.
It's shifting and demanding in some of these markets quality. In a sense, complying with those demands
Yeah.
increases your productivity and actually can help you move up the value chain, right?
Yeah.
I think the same is true for what you mentioned with some of the environmental sustainability of the production, right?
Yeah.
Deforestation, you
Yeah.
mentioned. You mentioned the border adjustment. Again, those things, they may be hard at first to
Yeah.
comply with, but they can actually stimulate changes that ultimately actually serve Cambodia well, because they raise efficiency,
Yes.
right? They improve energy efficiency, for example. If you think about deforestation, again, there are lots of benefits also to Cambodia if that is managed well, and if forests are protected, because it strengthens resilience to some of the climate risks we talked about. So a lot of these things, I very much agree with what you said, Minister Soprano. By raising the bar, it encourages you to meet the bar, and then you have some benefits from that as well.
I want to touch one element that we haven't really deep dive is the level of education that our diaspora is playing now. Because for every time I meet an ambassador, every time I always say thank you to them for one thing. Thank you, Ambassador, for giving our Cambodian student scholarship. So just to give you an idea, Australia, for the last 20 years, we have 24,000, about that number, right? 24,000 alumni who have studied in Australia in different high school, university, master, doctorate, whatever, right? But there are about 24,000 of them hanging around the city now. Many of them come back, take over the family business with 10 years of exposure in Australia. They know what they're talking about standard, about quality. The brown is a good example, the brown coffee. He studied in Australia. He come back and say, wow, they have good coffee, but good standard, this and that. And they came back and set up, and now they compete heads on with Starbucks. So I think the future of our Vision 2050 will rely a lot on our ability to harness this new source of skill, of knowledge, of competence, which is the youth. If you talk about AI, it's the youth. I'm an AI dummy, slightly better than AI idiot. But I don't know, how all these things work. But all these young people, they breathe AI, So what do you think, Fire?
Yeah, I think that the future for Cambodia's 2050 aspirations hinges on our ability to have a skilled workforce. And you can think of this workforce as having different parts of it. At the pointy end are these highly qualified, highly skilled, university educated students and adults. And I think it's fantastic that there is such a large diaspora. A lot of the research and competition has found that where innovations occur in low and lower middle income countries is exactly as you outlined, someone going abroad, learning that skill from a more advanced company, coming back and setting it up. There's the famous examples in Bangladesh where something like 50% of all of the CEOs of the garment manufacturing firms all studied in Korea at one point in time. And we see this in Silicon Valley as well, where there's this large diaspora that come back and then set it up in their own places. And that's essential. You need that innovation because, one of the ways we measure this innovation is we look at, I told you that average, 7,000 is the labor productivity for the average firm in Cambodia. But what if we zoom in on the frontier firms, these firms that are in the top 10%? And in Cambodia, the top 10% of firms are about 8 times more productive than the bottom 10%. That's a big difference. But when you look at that difference in other countries, for example, Vietnam or Bangladesh, that difference is 80 times.
Wow.
So the frontier firm in Bangladesh is 80 times more productive than their laggard firm. So it shows us that our frontier firms are not quite as innovative as they need to be. And we need to push that frontier. But that's just at the top end of the story. We have to look at the rest of the story. And it all comes down to how you started this show today. You talked about where Cambodia emerged from, the struggles, the ashes in which it emerged from. And I think that context is a big part of the story on human capital here.
Yeah.
The Khmer Rouge was only 50 years ago. This generations, yourself included, this isn't a story in ancient history book. This is a story that casts a very long shadow today. The life expectancy in Cambodia during that period was just 11 years old. That's what it was. Followed by a couple decades of more instability. In this context is where the education system emerged. And you look at the progress, only in 2009, 17% of students enrolled in high school. only 17% in upper secondary. Now it's 31%, right? That's almost doubled in a short period of time. That's a tremendous increase. In lower secondary, it went from 31% to 47%. That's a 50% increase, right? These are tremendous progresses in a short period of time. But if we're thinking about that tiger story, there's a long way to go still. When you look across the border, their enrollment rates are at 99%, right? The gap that we have to go to is still extremely high. And it's not just about enrollment, it's also about completions. When we look at the numbers, the average Cambodian from 15 to 65 years old, only about 12% of them have finished school. That was what it was 10 years ago. If you look at that number now, it hasn't changed, right? So we're not increasing the number of completed students to finish out of high school. But that's the older generation included, right? You can't expect your grandma, your mom and dad to go back to school. So we looked at the numbers for the youth, 15 to 24-year-olds. Their numbers are higher. They're at 20% in 2009, but in 2019, it's still 20%. It's not increasing.
It's not increasing.
And this 20% is your workforce for the next 45 years. And it's not just in completions. Where I think the human capital story comes to a front is in the quality. And this is what we have to solve in this generation to get to high income. And the quality of education in Cambodia needs improvement, right? We saw, you can measure it at either point. In grade 6, the national grade 6 exam, we see that half of the kids in 2016 were not passing mathematics. Fast forward to 2021, it's now 3/4 of kids are not passing mathematics. Now, COVID was a big part of that story. But what it's telling us is we're not improving in the quality. The same thing for 15-year-olds. We see only about 8% meet the minimum proficiency in the latest PISA scores. And so these 15-year-olds, these grade 6 students, they are going to be our workforce for the next 40 to 50 years. And it doesn't matter if we have brilliant university students, if we don't have a workforce that can support the building of the new age hospitals, the new age schools, the new age factories, we're not going to be able to compete. And so I think the biggest legacy, and I'm so impressed that this new government takes this human capital agenda so seriously. is what will define our ability to achieve this high income. How quickly we improve quality and outcomes so that we can furnish a workforce. And you alluded to this earlier. It's about the skills of the workforce now. How do we increase the education, the skill level of the existing workforce? They don't have to go back to school. Yeah. How do we raise that standard so they can move into a factory which is integrated with AI and technology? And I think that's the key thing we have to solve to give us a chance at competing with these other spaces and firms in other countries to get us towards high income.
So I think only one point to add here is that in a sense there is you have the opportunity only once, right? So once a child has gone through the education system, you cannot go back, and we all know that. And it starts not just in the school system; it's even earlier, right? With nutrition and early childhood education. And we know that these foundational years, it's impossible to catch up later on. Yes, you can do some lifelong learning, and we all will have to do that. But it's very important to move as quickly as possible on this agenda to ensure that as many kids as possible can get these foundations, so you get the workforce of the future, right? That's the issue with human capital. It's not like building a bridge. It's the period it takes to build human capital is much longer. So you need to start earlier, and you need to build the human capital not only for what the economy needs today, but what the economy needs tomorrow and in 2050 to some extent.
Well, we have 25 more years to go, right? Yeah. So I hope I'll be alive by then. So this way I can monitor what we discussed today makes sense or not.
We do the show again. In 25 years we come
In
back.
25 years we come back. So 25 years, in the history of a country is a blink of an eye. Right. It's a blink of an eye. Right. So we have a lot of work to do. Huh? I mean, from your description of the situation of our economy, of our workforce, there's a lot of things that we have to tackle. But the good thing is that we have a young government. Yeah. We have a young prime minister who is very dedicated, very passionate about development. He's an economist himself, so he can relate to a lot of things we discussed today. And I do hope that we can see more and more of this reform that respond to the issue that we raise now in the education, in the TVET, in the trade agenda, and the trade reform. All that thing matter. So what is your take? What are the things we have now to do for the next 25 years that we must do now?
Yeah, this is what the vision is about.
Yeah,
it takes.
It's a vision. It's a vision.
Yeah, and you can think of the vision in two parts.
Yeah.
It's what are we doing today and the next few years, and what do we need to think about for 25 years. And I think of this analogy of a house. If you have a house and this house is old, it's got weak foundations, the ceiling is falling in, the paint is scratched, there's mold in the wood. You have a choice. And what a lot of people do is they send in contractors and construction workers to keep trying to repair this house. Because that's the house you live in, right? There's leaks, you've got to deal with it. And I think that's part of what it's part of what government has to do, and what development institutions are advising is, okay, the most important leak to fix right now is we got to deal with this global issue right now. Someone send a builder there. And that's important. But that house will never support a high-income household, right? And it's only when you think about these vision exercises that you have the space and creative ability to think about building a new house, a new blueprint that will support a high-income Cambodia that isn't restricted by the foundations, by the poor roof, the leaks that this house has. And I think Cambodia has to have an eye on both. What are the immediate repairs we need to do to keep us moving and surviving in this house? But at the same time, let's send out some builders to design a new education system. Okay. One where the infrastructure, the schooling, the student-teacher ratios aren't 44-1, where technology is integrated, where public and private schools are both performing, rural and urban, boys and girls. Let's start working on that. But at the same time, let's try some of these initiatives like the government is doing of these, 300 schools where they're trying new ideas with. That's this new house, right? So you have to work on both of these fronts. But what the vision allows you to do is to deliberately spend time building a blueprint for a new house. And I think for Cambodia, it's across these three areas. It's the human capital, it's the business environment. And, we have a big team working on this vision from the World Bank side, and there's a even bigger team from the government of Cambodia side. And one of the questions that we've asked all of our teams is, we don't want you to just think about what is the gap between Cambodia and a high-income country, because a high-income country in 2050 is going to look very different to a high-income country in 2025. So you shouldn't be aiming for a target that we know is going to change. So think about institutions, business environment, schools, of what they should look like in 2050 when we want to be high income, and tell us how to get to that path. And that requires a little bit of imagination, right? We have to try and imagine in which direction jobs are going in what is going to be the role of knowledge when AI liberates it so easily and fluently for children. Is language as important for communication when I can just have an instant translation going on in my head? And so some of these things is what we have to imagine in this transition and race. And I think it's exciting. It gives us opportunities to sort of imagine this path forward. But it doesn't change the fact that there's work to be done today as well. And I think the human capital one is the most powerful point of this. A policy today determines your workforce in 2050. That's the timeline it takes for a child born today will graduate from high school and be in this 2050 workforce today. That starts today, will end up in 2050. And so I think that's where this 2050 vision helps us think about these different time horizons.
Well, Faya, Sep, I think we have covered quite a bit on this Vision 2050. It's very exciting. But I want to wrap up this session by saying that, yes, this is the Vision 2050. Vision is something you aspire to achieve there. From our discussion, it's a lot of things we have to do, a lot of hard work, a lot of capacity building, a lot of government reform. But at the end of the day, it's not just the government. At the end of the day, it's a lot about society. It's a lot about the private sector. It's a lot about the role of the farmer. It's a role of the business community. Of course, the government, we are driving, we're in the driver's seat. But ultimately, it's a collective effort that we all have to aspire to have that vision delivered by 2050. And I think here I'm addressing the audience. I think many of you will be watching this show. You will appreciate a lot of things we said. But what are you going to do about it? Are you going to sit and play game with your thing there, or you going to, instead of playing game, you're going to learn more, from AI or whatever. But here, my challenge to the audience is that, look, the government, we want to work hard to achieve Vision 2050, but we count on you as a stakeholder. You are a stakeholder. We cannot do without you. The government cannot do without the stakeholder. We cannot do without the private sector. We cannot do without the youth. So I think on that note, I want to wrap up by wishing all of us a good next 25 years. So Faya, thank you so much. Seth, thank you so much. It was an awesome dialogue. Yeah.
Thank you so much for
So
having us.
I'll see you all next time.